Ethan Caldwell had always felt like an outsider in his own family. Born and raised in Austin, Texas, he grew up in the shadow of his older brother, Ryan, who stayed behind to run the family's struggling mechanic shop, while Ethan left for New York City to build a career as a financial analyst. His parents, deeply rooted in their small-town values, had never truly understood why Ethan left. And despite his financial success, they often treated his absence as a betrayal. What they didn't know, however, was that for the past 6 months, Ethan had been secretly sending money to the shop's business account, believing that Ryan was using it to cover expenses and keep the place afloat. On Christmas Eve, Ethan returns home, hoping for a peaceful holiday. But instead of warmth, he is met with resentment from his parents, who still view him as the son who abandoned them. Over dinner, they praise Ryan endlessly, crediting him with keeping the shop running despite all the financial struggles. Ethan listens in stunned silence as his mother's voice swells with pride, claiming that without Ryan's hard work and sacrifice, the business would have collapsed months ago. That's when it hits him. Ryan has been taking full credit for the money Ethan has been sending. At first, Ethan waits, hoping his brother will acknowledge the truth. But as Ryan sits there, smirking, basking in their praise, Ethan's patience shatters. He finally speaks up, revealing that he has been the one sending money. But instead of gratitude, his parents immediately dismiss him, accusing him of trying to steal Ryan's moment. Ethan realizes with a painful certainty his parents will never believe him. Ethan's words hung in the air like an unwanted draft, chilling the warmth of the festive dinner. His mother, still clutching the serving spoon, let out a scoff, shaking her head in disbelief. "Ethan, why would you say something like that?" she asked, her voice filled with irritation rather than curiosity. His father, seated at the head of the table, sighed heavily, setting his fork down with an exaggerated clink. "Ryan has been here every single day, working himself to the bone to keep that shop afloat. You think you can just waltz in here after being gone for years and take credit for his sacrifices?" Ethan's jaw tightened, his fingers curling into fists beneath the table. He could feel his pulse in his ears, the heat rising to his face. He wasn't here to start a fight. He just wanted the truth to be acknowledged. But as he looked at his parents, their expressions hardened with immediate rejection. He knew that they had already chosen their side. Across the table, Ryan leaned back in his chair, a slow smirk creeping onto his face, the kind that made Ethan's blood boil. I don't know what you're talking about, little brother," Ryan said with mock innocence, taking a sip of his drink like this was all just some kind of game. "You've always had a habit of making things about yourself." Ethan clenched his teeth, his heartbeat thudding in his chest. "Dad's a lie," he said, his voice firm. "I've been making monthly deposits into the shop's business account since July. Thousands of dollars, all from my own paycheck. I have the proof." His father scoffed. "Then why would Ryan never mention it?" His mother folded her arms, her expression a mix of skepticism and disappointment. "Because it never happened," Ryan said smoothly, shaking his head. "I've been handling everything. If Ethan was really helping, wouldn't I know about it?" Ethan could hardly believe what he was hearing. Ryan wasn't just avoiding the truth, he was outright lying. And his parents? They didn't even hesitate to believe him. The blind faith they placed in Ryan made Ethan's stomach turn. "Are you serious right now?" Ethan snapped, his voice rising. "I sent that money to the shop's account, not to you personally. Did you even tell Mom and Dad about it? Or did you just let them believe you were some kind of hero?" His mother's frown deepened. "That's enough, Ethan," she said sharply. "You don't have to tear Ryan down just to make yourself feel important." His father sighed again, shaking his head like this was all some petty tantrum. "It's Christmas Eve," he muttered. "Can't you let us have one peaceful night?" Ethan let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. No matter what he said, they were never going to believe him. His father had already decided he was the problem. His mother had already made excuses for Ryan, and Ryan, he was just sitting there watching it all play out like it was entertainment. Ethan felt sick. He had spent months trying to help, sending money when they needed it, and yet, here they were, acting as though he had done nothing at all. The realization struck him like a punch to the gut. They had already written him off before he even walked through the door. Taking a deep breath, he steadied himself. "Fine," he said, his voice calm despite the storm raging inside him. "If you don't believe me, I'll prove it." He met Ryan's gaze, his brother's smug expression faltering for the first time. "Tomorrow morning, I'm going back to New York. I'll go to the bank and get every receipt for every deposit I've made. Then, let's see if you can keep up this act when I have the proof in my hands." Ryan's smirk flickered, but it was their parents' dismissive looks that hurt the most. His mother sighed like she was exhausted by his presence, and his father waved a hand, already done with the conversation. "Do whatever you want, Ethan," he muttered. "It's not going to change anything." Ethan pushed back his chair, the legs scraping against the hardwood floor. He had come home hoping for warmth, maybe even a little appreciation, but what he got was a stark reminder of where he stood. He wasn't part of this family, not really, and for the first time in his life, he stopped trying to be. Ethan drove through the empty streets of Austin, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The glow of Christmas lights lining the suburban houses felt like a cruel contrast to the storm raging inside him. His parents' unwavering belief in Ryan's lies played over and over in his head. Each dismissive look, each scoff, each accusation of just wanting attention, tightening the knot in his chest. He had spent months helping them, sending thousands of dollars to keep the shop afloat, yet the second Ryan spun his version of the story, they swallowed it whole without hesitation. The betrayal stung, but the truth was even more bitter. They had never truly believed in him. Maybe they never would. As he merged onto the highway, the lights of Austin faded in his rearview mirror. The road stretched endlessly ahead, just like his years of being the family outsider. He thought back to his childhood, to all the times Ryan had charmed his way out of trouble, while Ethan was always the one who had to explain himself. It had always been this way. Ryan was the golden son, the one who could do no wrong, while Ethan's successes were either dismissed or met with skepticism. But this time was different. This time he had proof. The long drive to New York City was filled with restless thoughts. The further he got from home, the more his anger began to crystallize into determination. By the time he reached his apartment, the exhaustion of the confrontation weighed on him, but he refused to sleep. Instead, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene in his head. His mother shaking her head, his father scoffing, Ryan smirking. The same cycle, over and over. But tomorrow, it would end. The next morning, Ethan walked into the bank in downtown Manhattan, his jaw tight, his steps purposeful. The air was crisp, the sidewalks dusted with remnants of snow from the previous night. Inside, the warm lighting of the bank did little to thaw the cold anger that had settled in his chest. He stepped up to the counter, greeted by a polite middle-aged teller. "Good morning. How can I help you?" the man asked. Ethan took a deep breath, his voice steady. "I need copies of every deposit I've made to Caldwell Auto Repair's business account since July." The teller nodded, typing into the system, before excusing himself to retrieve the records. As he stepped out into the cold winter air, he looked down at the receipts one more time. There was no denying it now, no way for Ryan to twist the truth, no excuse his parents could throw in his face. He was going back to Austin, and this time, he wasn't leaving without the truth being acknowledged. Ethan's heart pounded as he pulled into the driveway of his family's home in Austin, the stack of bank receipts secured in his bag beside him. The shop's neon sign flickered weakly in the distance, a stark reminder of why he had been sending money in the first place. His jaw tightened. Not once had Ryan mentioned his contributions, Not once had their parents questioned how the shop was staying afloat, and now Ethan was here to force them to face the truth. Stepping inside, he found his parents in the kitchen, his father reading the paper and his mother wiping down the counter. Ryan leaned against the fridge, arms crossed, his signature smirk already in place, as if he had been expecting Ethan to come crawling back. "Well, look who decided to show up again," Ryan drawled. "Didn't think you'd be back so soon." Ethan ignored him and walked straight to the table, dropping the thick stack of receipts in front of their father. The sound echoed in the quiet room. "Every deposit I've made into the shop's account since July," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. "All in my name, all from my paychecks." His father's brow furrowed as he picked up the receipts, flipping through them slowly. His mother leaned in, her face skeptical at first, but as her eyes scanned the papers, her frown deepened. This can't be right," she muttered. "Ryan said he was covering everything." Ethan turned to his brother, his stomach twisting, as he saw the flicker of panic cross Ryan's face, before he quickly masked it with a scoff. "Oh, come on," Ryan said, shaking his head with a laugh. "You really went all the way back to New York just to pull this stunt? How desperate are you for attention?" Ethan's patience snapped. "This isn't a stunt, Ryan. It's the truth. You let them believe you were the one saving the shop when you've done nothing but lie." His father set the papers down, rubbing his temple. "Ryan," he said slowly, his voice laced with something Ethan had never heard before. Doubt. "Is this true?" Ryan let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "You're actually considering this?" "Dad, come on. He probably faked these, or—" "You think I faked bank records?" Ethan cut in, stepping closer, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Go ahead, call the bank, ask them yourself. Every single one of those deposits came from me." His mother's lips pressed into a thin line, her hands tightening around the edge of the counter. "I don't understand," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ryan, why wouldn't you tell us?" Ryan's jaw clenched. "Because we didn't need his help," he snapped. "Because the shop is our family business, and Ethan left. He doesn't get to just throw money at it and expect to be the hero." Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "So that's what this is about? Your pride?" He turned to his parents. "I wasn't asking for a medal. I wasn't asking for recognition. I was just trying to help, and instead I get called a liar? I get accused of making this up?" Their father exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Ryan, why would you do this?" Ryan pushed off the fridge, suddenly defensive. "Oh, so now I'm the bad guy? All because Ethan waltzed in with a few pieces of paper?" His mother's face fell. "Ryan, if this is true, do you know what you've done?" But it was Ethan who answered. "He made me the villain in my own family," he said, his voice laced with exhaustion. "And you both let him." The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. His father wouldn't meet his eyes. His mother looked down, ashamed. And Ryan? Ryan stood there, trapped in his own web of lies, finally realizing that the game was over. Ethan stood there, waiting for an apology, waiting for acknowledgement, waiting for anything that might indicate his parents finally saw the truth. But the silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, until his father simply exhaled and shook his head, his expression one of disappointment, not at Ryan, but at Ethan. His mother still held the receipts as if they were tainted, refusing to look at him. And Ryan? Ryan just shrugged, stuffing his hands into his pockets, as if none of this mattered. Ethan's stomach twisted with a sharp, bitter realization. They weren't going to admit they were wrong, not today, maybe not ever. He let out a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm, even as anger and heartbreak threatened to overwhelm him. "I'm done," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. His parents watched as he tapped on the screen, then lifted it to his ear. "I'd like to stop all future transfers to Caldwell Auto Repair's business account," he said, his words slow and deliberate. Immediately, his mother's head snapped up. "Ethan?" "No." His voice was sharper now, his resolve solidifying. "I've spent months helping you, giving you money, giving you a way to keep this shop open, and you threw it in my face." His gaze flickered to Ryan. "You stole my help and turned it into a lie, and you—" He turned back to his parents, his voice breaking slightly. "You let him." His father sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "It's just money, Ethan." Ethan let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "No, it's trust, and you broke it." Ryan smirked, leaning against the counter. "Guess we'll manage without you then." Ethan gave him a long, cold stare before stepping away from the table. "Good luck with that," he muttered, grabbing his bag. He didn't wait for them to stop him. He didn't wait for an apology that was never going to come. He just walked to the door, letting the weight of their silence crush whatever hope he had left. Outside, the cold air hit him like a slap, but he welcomed it. It felt better than staying in that house for another second. As he slid into his car, hands gripping the wheel, he realized something. For the first time in his life, he felt free. No more trying to earn their approval, no more being the outsider desperately looking in. He had given them the chance to see the truth, and they had chosen their lie instead. That was on them. The drive back to New York felt different this time. Lighter. He wasn't running away. He was moving forward. 6 months passed without a single call from Austin. No messages, no apologies, not even a half-hearted excuse. Ethan wasn't surprised. He had been erased from the narrative just as Ryan wanted. He imagined his... and it did. One humid afternoon in the middle of summer, a knock sounded at his apartment door. Ethan wasn't expecting anyone, and when he pulled it open, his breath caught in his chest. His parents stood there, looking exhausted and unfamiliar. His father's posture had lost its usual authority. His broad shoulders slumped, as if carrying a weight too heavy to bear. His mother clutched her purse tightly, her knuckles white, her eyes filled with something Ethan had never seen before. Guilt. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then his father cleared his throat, his voice quieter than Ethan had ever heard it. "Ethan, we need to talk." Ethan could have slammed the door. He could have told them to leave, just as they had pushed him away when he tried to tell them the truth. But something in their faces stopped him. The arrogance was gone. The certainty. He stepped aside and let them in. They sat stiffly on his couch, looking out of place in his modern New York apartment. His mother ran a hand over her forehead, avoiding his gaze, while his father rubbed his palms together as if searching for the right words. Ethan crossed his arms, standing a few feet away. "Go on," he said coolly. "What do you want?" His father exhaled deeply, shaking his head. "We owe you an apology, a big one." Ethan said nothing, watching as his mother swallowed hard. "You were right," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ryan lied." The words should have felt satisfying, but they didn't. They just felt too late. His father nodded, finally looking Ethan in the eyes. "After you left, things started falling apart. The bills piled up. The shop needed repairs we couldn't afford. Customers weren't coming in like they used to. We kept thinking Ryan had it under control. He kept telling us he did. But," he sighed, "he didn't. And when we pressed him, he finally told us the truth." Ethan's chest tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "So, what? Now that you're in trouble, you suddenly believe me?" His mother flinched at his tone. "We should have believed you from the start." Her voice cracked. "We should have listened. But we didn't. And now, we just need you to know how sorry we are." Ethan let out a slow, bitter chuckle. "And where's Ryan?" His father shifted uncomfortably. He wanted to come, but we thought it was better if we spoke to you first." Ethan scoffed. Of course. Even now they were still protecting him. His mother's eyes were brimming with regret. "We don't expect you to forgive us right away, Ethan," she swallowed. "But we had to come here. We had to say it." For the first time in his life, Ethan saw something genuine in their shame. And for the first time, he realized he didn't need their validation anymore. A week after his parents' unexpected visit, another knock echoed through Ethan's apartment. He hesitated before opening the door, already guessing who it would be. Ryan. His older brother stood there, hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his worn-out jacket, his usual smugness absent for the first time in years. He looked thinner, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if carrying the weight of everything he had done. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice quieter than Ethan had ever heard it. Ethan considered slamming the door in his face. Ryan didn't deserve forgiveness, not after months of deceit, of standing by while their parents called Ethan a liar, of stealing credit for every dollar Ethan had sent. But curiosity got the better of him, and after a long pause he stepped aside. Ryan entered slowly, not sitting down, just shifting his weight awkwardly in the center of the room. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ryan exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. "I screwed up," he admitted, his voice strained. "Bad." Ethan folded his arms, unmoved. "Yeah, you did." Ryan nodded, staring at the floor. "I was jealous of you, Ethan. I always have been." He let out a bitter laugh. "You got out, you made something of yourself, and me? I was still here, stuck in that damn shop, trying to prove I was just as important." He finally lifted his gaze, and for the first time Ethan saw something real. Shame. "I lied because I wanted to feel like I mattered, and it was wrong, all of it." Ethan studied him, trying to gauge whether this was just another performance, but Ryan's voice cracked, his hands clenched into fists. "I didn't think it would go this far. I didn't think you'd actually leave." His eyes flickered with regret, "And I sure as hell didn't think I'd be the one who ruined everything." Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. Ethan's heart pounded, emotions clashing inside him. He had waited so long to hear this, to see Ryan admit his faults. And yet, the apology didn't bring the satisfaction he expected. It didn't erase the months of betrayal, the years of being pushed aside. Ryan inhaled sharply, forcing the words out. "I don't expect you to forgive me." His voice broke slightly. "But I needed to say it, to your face, not through Mom and Dad. I'm sorry, Ethan, for all of it." For the first time, Ryan didn't sound like he was making excuses. He sounded broken. Ethan didn't speak right away. Forgiveness wasn't something he could just hand over. But maybe, just maybe, this was the first step toward something real. Ethan didn't forgive Ryan that night. Trust wasn't something you rebuilt in a single conversation. But for the first time in years, Ryan wasn't hiding behind excuses or smug deflections. He had finally owned up to what he did. That was something. So Ethan didn't slam the door in his face. He didn't tell him to leave. He just nodded, a small, cautious acknowledgement that Ryan's words had been heard. That was all he could give, and for now, it was enough. Over the next few months, his parents called more often. At first, the conversations were stiff, filled with awkward pauses and unspoken regrets. But they were different now. There were no more dismissive sighs, no more accusations that he was just trying to cause trouble. They didn't outright say it, but Ethan could tell they had finally stopped blindly protecting Ryan. His father mentioned they had started handling the shop's finances themselves, and his mother let slip that Ryan had been working overtime to make things right. It wasn't an admission of guilt, but it was the closest they would ever come to saying, "You were right." And Ryan? He stayed out of Ethan's way. He didn't push for forgiveness or pretend things could go back to normal. When Ethan finally did visit Austin again, Ryan didn't meet him with smug grins or empty words. Instead, he just nodded, a silent truce between brothers who had spent too long standing on opposite sides. Ethan knew things would never be perfect. Their family had been broken for too long, but he also knew that for the first time, he wasn't the outsider anymore. He didn't need their validation. He didn't need to fight for a place at the table, because he had already found his place on his own terms. The story of Ethan and his family highlights a powerful lesson about self-worth, truth, and breaking free from toxic cycles. Ethan spent years trying to earn his family's approval, believing that if he worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, and proved his loyalty, he would finally be recognized. But instead, he learned a harsh truth. Some people will believe what they want, even when the facts are right in front of them. One of the biggest lessons is that seeking validation from those who refuse to see your value is a losing battle. No matter how much Ethan gave, his family only saw what they wanted to believe. It wasn't until the truth could no longer be ignored, until the consequences of their choices came crashing down, that they finally acknowledged his efforts. But by then, Ethan had already learned to stop chasing their approval. The story also teaches that forgiveness doesn't have to mean forgetting or returning to old patterns. Ethan didn't accept Ryan's apology immediately, but he allowed room for change. Ultimately, the lesson is clear. Self-respect comes from within, and sometimes walking away is the most powerful choice you can make.